Continued from the previous file, Literary Types, the Lyric, page 66. Question 32. Estimate the contribution of the Romantic movement to the tradition of the lyric and contrast it with the lyrics of the Victorian age. Answer. The Romantic period of poetry in Europe is the glorious age of lyric poetry. The reason for this rich flowering of lyrics in the earlier 19th century, in bracket 1798 to 1830, bracket closed, is to be sought in the main in the dominant characteristic of the age, its subjectivity. Romanticism has been sometimes defined as, quote, the emancipation of the ego in men, unquote. And since the lyric is the most personal of all literary forms, it had its heyday in this period. Romanticism is described as the extraordinary development of heightened sensibility, as the Renaissance of wonder. Baurat ascribes Romanticism to the development of imagination. All these characteristics are suitable for the production of lyrical poetry. Quote, egotistical sublime, Keats says about Wordsworth's poetry and applies to all the poetry of the age. The age tries to produce drama, prose, and the novel, but these are all permeated by the spirit of subjectivity. Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, Byron's Manfred are all self-projections, the expressions of the egocentric consciousness. Romantic movement swept Germany between 1798 and 1805. In France, it was delayed for 2 decades. In England, the way was cleared for romantic lyrical poetry by 2 outsiders. The Scottish regionalist poet Robert Burns, in bracket 1759 to 96, bracket closed, and William Blake, in bracket 1757 to 1827. William Wordsworth, in bracket 1770 to 1850, published the lyrical ballads, in bracket 1798, jointly with Coleridge, and in his preface to the second edition defines these own poems as arising from private rather than general associations. In Germany, there emerged about 1798 a fully grown romantic revolt with its own aesthetics, philosophy, and poetics, which placed sensibility and flashes of Orphic insight about rational experience. In Germany, Schlegel's, in France, Victor Hugo, enriched lyrical poetry. In England, Wordsworth, Coleridge, Shelley, Keats, and Byron made rich and significant contributions to the lyrical poetry. These lyrics of the 19th century Romanticism are basically more varied and more intense and profound than the stereotyped formal love lyrics of the Elizabethan age, except of course the lyrics of John Donne, which by their blend of wit and emotion attained new heights in lyric poetry. Wordsworth breathed a new spirit to the Romantic movement in his nature poems, Poems on Childhood, and in such poems as Ruth, Resolution and Independence, The Solitary Reaper, Lucy poems. His lyrical genius is at his best. For his new subjects, page 67, he employed new style. In grace and delicacy, as well as in philosophical depth and vigor, in language and meter, in bracket lines written on Tintern Abbey, Ode on Intimations of Immortality, bracket closed. Wordsworth's lyrics are remarkable achievements. Coleridge is a versatile genius. He attained the highest point of verbal beauty in his memorable lyrics on dejection, love, and Kubla Khan. He mainly excels in verse narratives, but they are characterized by exquisite lyrical fervor and craftsmanship. His poetry fulfills the definition of Romanticism as the Renaissance of wonder. Shelley was a lyric poet par excellence. The spontaneous utterance of his passion, the abundance of emotive imagery, and the rich melody of his poetry are an abiding contribution to English lyrical poem. His poems like Ode to the West Wind, To a Skylark, The Cloud, I Arise from Dreams of Thee testify to his emotional fervor and musical competence, which are the chief marks of lyrical poetry. Keats' lyrics are characterized by sensuous imagery, slow leisurely movement of the verse. He expresses his despondent mood in a number of odes: Ode on Melancholy, Ode to a Nightingale, Ode to Psyche, and Ode to a Grecian Urn. His lyrics have the most compelling enchantment for lovers of pure poetry. Romantic lyricism is continued in the poetry of Tennyson, Arnold, Swinburne, and D.G. Rossetti. Hardy in the Victorian period, but in this emotions was tempered by intellect. They wrote poetry with a greater consciousness of the problems and peculiarities of the age. Browning, however, stands apart with his dramatic monologues. They are lyrics, but they are objective and more or less impersonal. Language is colloquial and the music is often harsh. Tennyson's short lyrics, Tears, Idle Tears, Break, 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 Crossing the Bar, and long lyrics like the Lotus Eaters, in bracket, choric songs, bracket closed, and some stanzas of In Memoriam, remarkable for their pictorial details and lulling music, but they do not have the imaginative fervor of Shelley, sensuous ecstasy of Keats, patriotic fire of Byron, and nature mysticism of Wordsworth. Tennyson is a good versifier, but not a poet with consistent reflective power and intensity of feeling as we find in Shelley and Keats. Arnold practices poise and balance of classical school. He can convey deep personal feelings with restrained expressions, imagery, and melody. His lyrics are to Marguerite, Dover Beach, Quiet Work, Resignation, etc. His lyrics are reflective and intellectual. The classic spirit reveals itself in the lucid style, the absence of violent effects and decorative graces, for which Arnold blamed Tennyson. Tennyson can effect skillful manipulation of the page 68, rhythm, vowel music, and consonantal effect. He could convey the atmosphere of seductive luxury in Lotus Eaters, lulling music in Sweet and Low, and bugle call in the splendor falls of castle walls. D.G. Rossetti, in his The Blessed Demoiselle, My Sister's Sleep, Jenny, uses symbolic details to suggest a whole complex of feelings like the emblems used by the primitive Italian painters. The Blessed Demoiselle is remarkable for the combination of sensuousness and mysticism. Women poets like Elizabeth Barrett Browning, in bracket Sonnets from the Portuguese, bracket closed, and Christina Rossetti, in bracket When I am dead, after death, remember, bracket closed, can write with refreshing simplicity, sincerity and fervor. Swinburne shows mastery of music and in this respect is allied to Tennysonian tradition. His hymn to Proserpine, Garden of Proserpine, Faustine, breathe the spirit of sensuality and are marred by exuberance of music and passion, which is neither very personal nor very new. He manifested decadent romanticism in his emphasis on pure aestheticism. Lyrics in the Victorian period could not match the imaginative idealism of Wordsworth, metaphysical subtlety of Coleridge, revolutionary fervour of Shelley, passionate fire of Byron, and compelling enchantment of sensuous beauty of Keats. Question 33. Is the original meaning of the word lyric adequate for all poetry that we refer to today as lyrical? Answer. Lyric comes from the word lyre, meaning a musical instrument. Lyric has its origin in musical expression, singing, chanting, and recitation to musical accompaniment. The lyric, the drama, and epic had their origins in a spontaneously melodic expression which soon adapted itself to a ritualistic need and thus became formalized. Music in dramatic and epic poetry was secondary to other elements of the works, it being mainly mnemonic device (device for being remembered). In the case of lyric poetry, the musical element is intrinsic to the work intellectually as well as aesthetically. A lyric is the expression of the poet's personal moods, feelings, or thoughts. It is intimately personal, sometimes confessional. It is the sincere expression of the poet's deeply felt emotion which comes to him at a particular moment, and he tries to communicate the feeling in musical language. Thus, the essence of lyrical poetry is personality. Although the poet makes his personal feelings typically human and universal by his treatment of the personal feelings and thoughts. A lyric differs from drama and epic in its most essential aspect. While a lyric is personal and subjective, drama and epic are impersonal and objective. A lyric deals directly with the thoughts, page 69, and feelings of the poet, while drama and epic deal with the outer world of passion and action. While, therefore, in subjective poetry, which is the poetry of introspection, the poet looks into his heart to write and even draws the outer world down into himself and steeps in its own emotions. In objective poetry, he projects himself into the life without and seeking there his motives and subjects, handles these with the least possible admixture of his own individuality. In a lyric, the poet is self-intrusive. In the drama and epic, the poet is more or less detached and distant. His view of life emerges not in a direct, obtrusive manner as in a lyric, but in an indirect way through the handling of the characters and situations. A lyric tells while a drama shows. In Greece, Melic poem was intended to be sung to musical accompaniment. With the Renaissance, poets began suiting their work to a visual rather than auditory medium. The poet ceased to compose his poem for musical presentation, but instead wrote it for the readers. The lyric poem inherited and employed specific themes, meters, attitudes, images, and myths, but in adapting itself to a new means of presentation, the lyric found itself bereft of the very element which had been the foundation of its lyricism, music. Until the end of the 17th century, critics failed to distinguish between the true or melodic lyrics, such as the songs of Shakespeare, Campion and Dryden, and the non-musical verbal lyrics of Donne, Marvell and Waller. The neoclassical critical concern with the tragic and epic forms in the 18th century was so overwhelming that the lyric became lost as a subject for discussion. With the Romantic movement, lyric was equated with poetry. Wordsworth defines poetry as, quote, the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, unquote. Hegel says that poetry is an intensely subjective and personal expression. Attributes of brevity, metrical coherence, subjectivity, passion were given to a lyric poem. There are, however, schools of poetry which are not susceptible to such criteria. Brevity is not always adhered to. In bracket, Milton's La Allegro and El Penseroso and many romantic poems. Bracket closed. Imagist lyrics are hardly impassioned. The metaphysicals combine wit and passion, sensuality and spirituality. The modern lyric poems strive for the extinction of the personality and for attaining dramatic objectivity through image pattern. Poetry is not music, but it is representational of music in its sound patterns, basing its meters and rhyme on the regular linear measure of the song. It employs cadence and consonance to approximate the, page 70, the tonal variation of a chant or intonation. Thus, the lyric retains structural evidence of its melodic origins. Rhyme is important for creating and sustaining the tonal effect of the poem, but it is not music that is alone necessary for producing the desired poetic effect. Northrop Frye points out that poetry is, quote, an internal mimesis of sound and imagery, unquote. In its modern meaning, a lyric is a type of poetry which is mechanically representational of a musical architecture and which is thematically representational of the poet's sensibility as evidenced in a fusion of conception and image. Lyric poetry in its development through the ages has acquired various modes and forms. The Egyptian, Hebrew and Greek lyrics had their origins in religious activity. Greek lyrics were chanted, sung and danced. The Dithyramb may have been composed to commemorate the death of some primitive vegetable gods or the birth of Dionysus. The essential element of the Greek lyric was its meter. The earliest Greek lyrics were folk in origin, but even in the works of Homer and Hesiod, there is evidence of an artistic concern with the lyrical mood and subjects, if not the lyrical form. The 5th century in Greece produced some of the best of the lyric poets, Simonides, Pindar and Bacchylides. It was then that the lyric found such magnificent expression in the choral odes of Sophocles, Aeschylus and Euripides. The Greek critics were, however, more concerned with the tragedy and the epic than with the lyric poetry. The few extant comments which they made predicate the musical nature of the genre. The private insight the subjective focusing of experience is more keenly apparent in Roman lyrics than in other ancient works. Ovid, Catullus, Tibullus celebrate private feelings in their lyrics. Ovid in the sorrows of his exile, Catullus in his amorous, Virgil in his rustic pleasures, Tibullus in his love pangs, and so on. Medieval lyrics remain in abundance, and they exert a special charm for the modern reader in their mixture of naivety and sophistication. But lyric poetry was still a thing of the people, composed to be sung and enjoyed. It is, however, not true to say that lyric and music were dissociated with the Renaissance. But since the Renaissance, the lyric has remained a verbal rather than a musical discipline. Renaissance lyricists writing for an aristocratic audience may simply have unconsciously adapted their forms to a different medium. In England, the publication of Total's Miscellany in 1557 marked the beginning of the most lyrical of England's poetic eras. Many collections came out, and the sonnet form was essayed and developed on a variety of themes. The lyric poetry may be divided into three types: the lyric of vision, the lyric of thought or idea, and the lyric of emotion. The lyric of vision or emblem has been called by Ezra Pound as ideograms. This is the most externalized kind of lyric, utilizing the pictorial element of print to represent the object or concept treated in the context of the poem itself. It is a literal attempt to follow Macleish's admonition that, quote, a poem should not mean but be, unquote. The most recent practitioner of lyrical emblemism include Amy Lowell, William Carlos Williams, E. E. Cummings, and the French Dadaists of the 1920s. The lyric of thought or idea is the most personal but still objective in tone. This school of lyricists is classically oriented, believing with Horace that poetry must be utile as well as dulce. This type of lyrics may be expository or didactic. The expository lyric writers include Boileau, Dryden, Cowper, Schiller, and St. John Perse and T.S. Eliot in the modern age. The didactic lyrics include the allegorical, satiric, and vituperative speeches. The most subjective or internal strain of modern lyric poetry is the lyric of emotion. It is this lyrical type which has become synonymous with poetry. The lyric of emotion comprises three major groups: the sensual lyric, the imaginative lyric, and the mystical lyric. The sensual lyric enjoys an unbroken continuity from the 16th century to the 20th century. The sonnets of Ronsard, the love poetry of Elizabethans, the sensuous images of Keats, and the Romantics. The sensualism of the yellow 90s shows the continuity of this type. The sensual tradition is sustained in differing forms by Shakespeare, Donne, Collins, Heine, Baudelaire, Mallarmé, Millet, and Dylan Thomas. The imaginative or intellectualized lyric of emotion furnishes a host of examples in the lyrics of Goethe, Rilke, Valery, Auden, Empson, and Spender. Ode and elegy belong to lyric poetry, but they have different formal patterns and different modes. They call for separate treatment. The lyric has been expanded and developed through the centuries until it has become one of the chief literary instruments which focus and evaluate the human condition. Question 34. Would it be correct to define lyric poetry as the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings? Answer. It is said that a lyric is the spontaneous expression of deeply felt emotions. This definition stresses the importance of emotions, continued in the next file.